All right, everybody, and welcome back. We are in 1 Samuel, where we left off. Tonight we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 28. So just to recap for anybody who's new and to give us an overview again, we are doing this series called The Book. The Book Bible Study started years ago with Genesis, and we're going chapter by chapter all the way through. Like I said, we are in 1 Samuel chapter 28. But really we're looking at this book, the Bible, which is actually a library, 66 books written by over 40 authors, but we all know the real author was God, because no way humans could write this on their own, right? Especially how much it proves itself over and over again. And we're reading the Bible as if it's one story, because it really is. One story, it's through one family. And we've learned, especially throughout this book and before, that God's family of Israel isn't any less sinful. They were just the chosen people that Messiah was going to be brought through, right? And like I said, we are in the history books. We started with Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and now we're near the end of 1 Samuel, actually, and it continues along. And I love to reiterate that if you understand the books of Moses, the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first five, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and then you understand the history books from Joshua to Esther, you will understand the Old Testament narrative. Of course, there's the 400-year silent gap, intertestamental period. That's when Greece comes in. Like I said, they're the only empire that's not really written extensively about. But you can kind of follow along, and once you understand this, all the other books of poetry, of the prophets, all take place within this narrative, right? So that's what we're doing right now, reading all these books through order to see the story, and we can see the story continue to unfold. Remember that Israel is called Israel, even though he was the third generation. Remember, it was Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob's renamed Israel. But the nation's named Israel because, remember, they were slaves in Egypt, and Jacob, or Israel's family, was the one that came out as the nation. So that is the nation of Israel, and we learned about how they had groups of judges, basically these leaders, right? It was Moses, then Joshua, and then a bunch of them, Othniel and Samson, Jephthah, all those judges we talked about. And now in 1 Samuel, we're at a transition period, right? Samuel's the last judge and the first prophet, and that's what we were learning about. And since, in our story, he has since died. Remember, the book started with him being, born after Hannah's prayer and Eli and all that kind of stuff. But now we're more into the David narrative. So just a really quick recap for anybody who's new. And then also, we haven't been here for 2 weeks. Just a reminder, picking up at 1 Samuel 19 on our recap, only because our narrative is really now dealing with David's fugitive years, right? And that's what we're dealing with here. So remember, Saul had a demon or some evil spirit tormenting him. And that's how David got introduced to him, helped him out. But because, Saul was prideful and had a demon, he's been trying to kill David as if he's the enemy, when really David is obviously not the enemy. And remember, last week I talked about, there's the last time, I guess it was a couple weeks ago now, how David fled to Gath, which was the Philistines, right? Land of the Philistines, and he pretended to be crazy, right? It's the only time I can remember in the Bible where somebody pretends to be crazy, but that was so they didn't know who he was. I talked about how they didn't have photo IDs back then. They didn't have Facebook, so they couldn't say, hey, which one of you is David? You had to just go off of people's word and what they were known for. So David escaped, and we came back to that last time as well. Then, of course, David went to the caves of Adullam. That's where he got all of his buddies, 400 that turned into 600 men. Basically, these rogue guys that they didn't have any military experience until Keilah needed saved. Remember, they saved the city of Keilah, even though that's Saul's job. Saul was the king, but David has more of a king's heart than Saul. And even in his fugitive years, David gets his bandits together, basically, and goes and takes care of everything. Then Saul can pursue David as if he was the enemy. Right after that, we learned about that. And of course, he went to the caves of En-Gedi as he was looking for David. Talk about a synchronicity. He just happens to go to the bathroom in the one cave that David and his men are hiding at. But David spares him, right? And we learned about how this reminded him of the cutting away of the robe, just like the ripping away of Samuel's robe. And he confronted him to let Saul know he spared him. And Saul said he was going to let him go. Then we had that little story about David and Nabal, while his men, were out there protecting his guys, Nabal's people. Nabal didn't want to pay him the money. David was going to kill him until Abigail, stepped in. I said that was, the gospel right there in action. She was going to take on the sins of Nabal when she didn't really have to, right? And she's spared there. Nabal ends up getting killed by the Lord, not David, and Abigail becomes his wife. And then Saul pursued David again. He took back his word. He said he was going to stop chasing him, but he did not stop chasing him because Saul is a sinful, prideful man. And he begins chasing him, and I talked about how even maybe the demons got back to him to do this. We're not sure. But David spared him again. Remember I said this is very similar to the tent peg of Jael. Could have driven it right through his head. He could have let his guy do that, but he didn't. He stopped him again. He said, nope, we're not going to do that. And David then, this time, instead of being close, deals with Saul a little bit differently, yells from afar rather than being up close, right? And he was on the other side, so his guys were behind if they had to attack, because he doesn't trust Saul anymore. Not that he trusted him to begin with, but now he really doesn't trust Saul, and he spared him twice. And then the last time we were here, the last Bible study we did was 1 Samuel 27, and this is where David fled to Achish, who was the king of the Philistines. And remember, the Philistines are the group of people where Goliath came from, right? And that's what David's really known for by a lot of people that might not even know the Bible. They know David killed Goliath, this Philistine. Well, now you have David, like I said, maybe one of his worst chapters ever for David. Is he runs away, he partners up with Achish, the king of the Philistines. And remember, this is the same guy that he pretended to be crazy in front of. He had spittle coming down his beard because he didn't have guys back then. Now he has an army, now he's not, there's different circumstances here. And Achish and him kind of make an allegiance, and it's kind of crazy. He defects basically to the Philistines, but we learned it was kind of an artificial defection, right? Because David asked for a city. That's where he gets Ziklag. That's how he has that city, right? And he asked for that down in the outskirts of the south, so the Philistines couldn't really know what was going on. And I remember David's real big sin here is when he'd go and raid these places, he was now not killing for God, which all of these were groups that he was killing, were the enemies. They were technically Canaanites. But he was doing it for profit, and it wasn't really guided by God, but a lot of sin involved. And remember, he was killing all the women and the children, so they couldn't go back to Gath and say, hey, David's killing us. He's not killing the Israelites. So remember, David was lying. He lied to Achish. He said, yeah, I'm taking care of all the Israelites. So Achish, in his mind, thought, oh, wow, David, he's a stench to his people. Israel hates him, and now he's really a Philistine, right? So he thinks that he believes him, but really David was lying the whole time and wiping out some of the Canaanites, but really making, this city work and this life work for his people. They stayed there over a year. Now they're in a fortified city. They weren't hanging out in caves anymore. They actually now had their own city. And that's where we left off. Now, and then just remember, just to give you an idea of where we're at, because I like maps. It's hard to read the Bible without some visuals sometimes, so just for things were happening. Remember Ziklag, we're not sure which one of those it is, but he had a town somewhere down there in Philistia. You can see En-Gedi was where the cave was, right there in the Dead Sea. You can see we're in the southern part of Israel. Gath is in the north part of this picture. That's still very much south in the country there. So you can see where all that went, or that happened. The ball was from Carmel, right? Ziph and Maon was the wilderness they were running and hiding from Saul and En-Gedi. And then Adullam and Keilah, remember, he defended the city. So you can see it was all happening actually down in southern Israel, and then even in the southwest, that was Philistia, where the Philistines were living. And now today's story, I don't know if I think I put a map up at the end, I can't remember. But today's story, it's going to be partaking more up north. It actually wouldn't even be on this map, where we're about to go in 1 Samuel 28. So without further ado, what we do here is we're going to go ahead and read the entire chapter, verse by verse, and then we're going to go back and break it down into sections. So you guys can turn to 1 Samuel chapter 28. 1 Samuel chapter 28, and we got 25 verses tonight. All right. It says, in those days, the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, understand that you and your men are to go out with me in the army. David said to Achish, very well, you should know what your servant can do. And Achish said to David, very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life. Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shunem. And Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams, or by Urim, or by prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said to him, behold, there is a medium at Endor. So Saul disguised himself and put on other garments and went, he and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night. And he said, divine for me by a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you. The woman said to him, surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death? But Saul swore to her by the Lord, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? He said, Bring up Samuel for me." When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." The king said to her, "Do not be afraid. What do you see?" And the woman said to Saul, "I see a God coming up out of the earth." He said to her, "What is his appearance?" And she said, "An old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe." And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Saul answered, "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me what I shall do." And Samuel said, "Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek, therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel also into the hand of the Philistines." Then Saul fell at once, full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel. And there was no strength in him, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. And the woman came to Saul. And when she saw that he was terrified, she said to him, "Behold, your servant has obeyed you. I have taken my life in my hand and have listened to what you have said to me. Now, therefore, you also obey your servant. Let me set a morsel of bread before you, and eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way." He refused and said, "I will not eat." But his servants, together with the woman, urged him, and he listened to their words. So he arose from the earth and sat on the bed. Now the woman had a fattened calf in the house, and she quickly killed it. And she took flour and kneaded it, and baked unleavened bread of it. And she put it before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they rose and went away that night. All right. There's a lot going on in there. Oh, I did put a map in. Before we dive in deeper, here's the map of what's going on here. So you can see we were down, there's Hebron, there's Ziklag, there's Gath. Down in the south we were looking at En-Gedi, was by the Dead Sea. Now we're all the way up north. You can see Endor is up there. There's Shunem, which was mentioned as well, and Mount Gilboa, where Saul and his people were from the story. So you can see things have moved north. And this is important because the Philistines actually, that's not their land up there. So now they've pushed about 20 miles or so up north, which means they're making an offensive attack here, which is probably why Saul is confused. But I want to kind of put that map there just to see now we have now moved up into the north, the Valley of Jezreel, which is actually, ironically, where Armageddon will take place. Megiddo is up in that area here. So just to give you guys a visual, because I like to do that because it's hard to read maps through words. So this is kind of where everything is taking place. So first, let's just break down those first 7 verses. So it starts out saying, now the first 2 verses, look at these. "In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, 'Understand that you and your men are to go out with me in the army.' David said to Achish, 'Very well, you shall know what your servant can do.' And Achish said to David, 'Very well, I'll make you my bodyguard for life.'" Now these first 2 verses are going to kind of seem out of context because really what they're doing is almost stitching together 27. So this is kind of, there's going to be an interlude. The rest of the chapter will be an interlude and not deal so much with these 2 verses, but we will see these dealt with later. So it's almost kind of like foreshadowing in a way that this is going to be an issue for David. So what's going on here? Now remember, David has that town Ziklag, right, where his people are staying. And Achish, the king of the Philistines, thinks he's been helping him, thinks he's been killing the Israelites when he lied. So now the Philistines, as we learned, have gathered their forces for war. Like I showed in that map. They're going to make an offensive attack moving up north. And you see David's dilemma here. Achish tells David that him and his men are going to go out and be part of the army. Basically, he's going to become a Philistine now. Like, although he said he was fighting for the Philistines, he wasn't really. So now you can see kind of a conundrum, right? And Achish says, "You're going to be with me." And David kind of goes along with it. "Very well, you should know what your servant can do." Like, "Yep, I'm a great warrior here," right? So he kind of agrees with it. And then Achish says he'll make him the bodyguard. So you can see this linkage here. Achish really likes David. And we don't know, David has been very deceptive, so we're not totally sure, and you'll see later on, so we're not totally sure he would have stayed with the Philistines or not, and we're going to get to that in the next chapter as we get to it down the road. But this is kind of, it builds up into what is going to happen with Saul, but we're also going to see this conundrum play out later, where David is now implicated. So, like, imagine if, you couldn't live in the United States for a while, but Putin wants you to work for the Russian army. It'd be weird for you, but okay, I'll do it, but you really don't want to, and it's this whole ruse. Kind of similar situation because Achish has been fooled. So that kind of lays the groundwork now. So David has his own conundrum, and we're not even going to see that play out until after this chapter. So you have that all going on. But now, as you see, the Philistines gathered their forces for war, so they're planning this war, and that's where the rest of the chapter kind of goes. So verses 3 through 7 we'll break down now. So it says, "Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him, and they buried him in Ramah." So this was actually already mentioned, I think, in chapter 15. So when something's mentioned that's already been mentioned before, it usually has something to do with what's about to take place. And you'll see it's going, as we already read, it's going to have a lot to do with what takes place. Samuel is dead. It wants you to know Samuel's dead. He's been buried in Ramah. And we're going to revisit that a little bit as well. And also, it said Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. Now, it doesn't say why, but it's also linked there with Samuel, because Saul has not really been that godly of a king. He's kind of one of those guys that pretends to be godly in a way, and sometimes he is, but he's really not. But here, he did do one thing God said to do back in the books of Moses. You could read all about mediums or necromancers. Obviously, necro meaning death. People basically bring people back from the dead. A medium, a go-between between the living and the dead, sometimes called witch. We'll see that sometimes translations will later use the term witch rather than medium. But basically, Saul kicks him out of Israel, says they shouldn't be here anymore, which is actually a godly thing to do. Because God says you should not deal. You shouldn't do seances and Ouija boards and ghost hunting. You shouldn't do any of that stuff. Get it out, right? So Saul's actually being obedient. And maybe, it does come right after those verses, maybe, Saul's starting to get that fear. That fear, because he did tell David the last chapter, he knows David's going to be king. He knows his end's coming up, right? And maybe he's trying to live godly now. So, maybe if I just kick out all the mediums and the necromancers, that will help. So we see that he had done that at some point before. And then, of course, it says the Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shunem. We saw that was up in the northern part there, up there. And Saul gathered at Israel and they camped at Gilboa. So you can see they're both up north now. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid and his heart trembled greatly. So you can tell he's terrified. He sees a big, massive army. And it's funny because this is like Saul's whole life story. The whole reason David fought is because he was afraid and they were afraid of Goliath. That was the Philistines again. And they're the thorn in the side that keeps coming back. And remember, you can really trace this back to Joshua. Joshua and the people should have wiped out all these groups, and they didn't. And that's why I say that Israel even today still has problems because of that. But you can see this comes over and over again. And Saul is afraid because the Philistines, have been a thorn in his side. And Saul gathered all Israel, like I said, and camped at Gilboa. So he's kind of preparing, but he's afraid. His heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. Remember the Urim and the Thummim? It was their legal way of divination. You're not allowed to do divination, but that was the one way they were allowed to do it back then. He's trying the Urim, the Thummim, that's not working. He's going to the prophets. The prophets have no word for him. He's asking God to give him something in a dream, and nothing is happening, right? And who knows why, because we can't ever be inside God's mind. But I think God's pretty much over Saul, right? Saul, let David go the first time, and then went after him again. He's been, following and trailing him. And at some point, you have to understand that when you live in sin, perpetual sin, over and over and over, even if you repent and you go right back and you're just living in the sin, that there's going to be times that God won't answer. And this is really what's happening to Saul. God could have delivered an answer, right? And you could also say that maybe God's not answering, because we don't know exactly why. Maybe God's not answering because he's told Saul everything. He told him everything actually multiple times. And as we'll see tonight, the message he gets when we get to that is it's something he's heard before. So also, God might have nothing new to tell me. He really doesn't have anything new to tell Saul. And Saul wants help with fighting the Philistines, and God is giving him the silent treatment. So you can see how much, how fickle Saul is, and we can be fickle too, right? It's not like we're perfect either. But Saul, just a little bit ago, we read about how he kicked out all the mediums, all the necromancers. And then when he can't get a dream or a Urim or the prophets, all of a sudden it says, then Saul said to his servant, seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said, behold, there's a medium in Endor. So isn't that crazy? It kind of reminds me of the people that say, I'm done with alcohol, I'm done with beer, I'm done with all this stuff, and they get it out, and it's out of the house, and they say, hey, somebody go get me a beer, I need a beer right now. It's like, You just got you eradicated. I thought you were being holy and getting this out of your life, right? Same thing. He was kicking all these things out until he needed one, and he didn't really need one. He's panicked and he feels helpless, right? He feels helpless because God's not answering him, right? So he panics and says, "I want an answer now," and now he's going the wrong way. And you should know right here, it never goes well. You're never going to outsmart God. But Saul, that's just how Saul thinks, right? Because Saul's been trying to kill David, even though he was told a long time ago. And then he even, told David that it wasn't going to happen. But you see Saul still try to destroy God's plan like he's going to do it, right? And he's still trying to get his own way. And you see that here. Well, if God's not going to answer me, then I'm going to go get one of those women that I kicked out that were necromancers and mediums, and I'm going to go see one of them. And he inquires and he asks his men. And what's really interesting is it seems, we don't know how, but the servants know exactly where one is right away. And it's actually in close proximity because Endor's right up there. Remember, the Philistines are in Shunem, he's in Gilboa. So they're like, oh, there's one right in the neighborhood here. How they knew that, I don't know. But she's probably pretty popular. I don't know. She might have been pretty successful, and everybody knew the witch of Endor. If you really need something, it's like we have this here. If you want to find something that's illegal, you can find it in the United States. You can find it. You can just whisper, hey, well, if I want this, where can I go? Oh, you can do, There's always these secret black market things going on. Same thing here, I'd imagine. Like, oh, hey, if you really want to get information from spirits and some information, there is this one up here. So even Saul's men knew about it, and they send him to this medium, or witch sometimes it's called, at Endor, which is right there in the north. And this is where the story gets really bizarre. So, verse 8, Saul first disguises himself, right, put on other garments, and he had 2 men, so he brings 2 guys with him, 2 of his servants probably, and they came to the woman by night. So they go and they find her. And I love that he's in these different clothing. So he would have had regal, clothing, royal, king clothes that he usually wore, and this time he's going out. So basically, imagine, the president or something like that in a suit and tie going out in just like some sweatpants and a hoodie with some shades on, right? It's basically the equivalent. He's going incognito. He doesn't want anybody to know he's the king. So he goes there and he comes to the woman also by night, right? And when you do things by night, it's usually you're not proud of it. You just remember Nicodemus approached Jesus at night because he's afraid to do it. He didn't want anybody else to see what he was actually doing, right? So when you do something by night, it's usually, in darkness, usually to be secret. So he's hiding himself, he's disguised, and he's doing it at night. Saul's not proud of this, and he probably even knows this is a little sketchy, but he's doing it anyway. I don't know why, but that's how Saul goes. But we're sometimes not any different, right? So he comes to the woman, and he says, divine for me by a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you. The woman said to him, surely you know that Saul has done. Now he has cut off the mediums, necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for me? She's saying, listen, I don't know if you heard about this, but King Saul is out here, and he's kicked out all these. And if you ask me to do this is pretty much illegal. You're asking me to break the law, and you're basically going to trap me into this death. Like, why are you here bothering me? But then I love what it says here in 10. I don't love it, it's just kind of ironic. Saul swore to her by the Lord. As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Now this verse is it's all around crazy. Because first off, what did Saul do before we read in the beginning? He kicked out all the necromancers, the mediums. Why would he do that? Well, because the Lord does not care for that. That's sinful, right? Then you have somebody, now he's going back to these necromancers and mediums, and he's saying, hey, by the Lord will not punish you for this sin. Like, who does he think he is? He's talking almost like how Jesus would talk, except Jesus is allowed to forgive sins, and he never commended sin. Never said, oh, you can sin and get away with it. But that's basically what Saul is doing. And not only that, Saul could have just said, hey, don't worry about it, you can do it. But he says, as the Lord lives. Man, he's actually probably, God's grace, that he wasn't struck dead in that very moment for putting words into God's mouth and forgiving sin. That was actually sin, right? And saying, oh no, go ahead and sin. Go ahead and do it and God will forgive you. So you can see how, flippant and messed up Saul is as a king. Verse 11, then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? He said, bring up Samuel for me. Then when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. So we'll stop right there. So why have you deceived me? For you are Saul. So he asked, hey, bring Samuel up. So she does her thing. And when the woman saw him, she cries out with a loud voice and says, you deceived me. You are Saul. Which is really interesting. So before she didn't know that, right? She's like, hey, haven't you heard about King Saul? And now all of a sudden he says, hey, bring up Samuel. She calls for Samuel, and he brings And Samuel comes out. She says, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. So now she thinks you're trying to kill me. Basically, like, this is a government sting. Like, oh, they set up a sting on me. They're going to try to kill me. This is all a plan. And so she asked him, and what does it say here? Why did you see me? The king said to her, do not be afraid. What do you see? So he's like, hey, don't worry about that. Shut up. I know, I'm not going to kill you. Just keep telling me more. What's going on? What's happening here? And the woman said to Saul, I see a god coming up out of the earth. He said to her, what is his appearance? And she said, an old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe. And Saul knew that it was Samuel. And he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. So what's really interesting, the language here. Now, some people get really wrapped up in this. And they'll say, she said, I saw a god, and Samuel's not a god. And even the term Elohim, that's plural. Like, what is she talking about? Some people will say that she saw a demon. But I don't think so. Because a demon isn't going to really give godly information. What you see later is godly stuff. I think she used the term God because she's a pagan, right? And she doesn't speak Christianese. She doesn't speak the language, right? Just like some other person might say something like that. Or like, oh, you're a god for knowing that. It's like, oh, no. That's not what you said. That's not the appropriate terminology, right? You're a messenger or something like that. But what she's calling him as a god, she knows something supernatural is happening. She might even think it's a god. She's a pagan. She believes in the gods, the Gentile gods. And she might think they came up or some demon or some, fallen angel or whatever it may be. So that's why she refers to him as a god. However, I still think that it was Samuel himself, and we'll see why. So he asks his appearance, and it says, as an old man is coming up, and he's wrapped in a robe. This basically would have probably been what they call a mantle, that the prophets would have worn, a mantle. And it says Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with homage. So now he knows it's Samuel. Samuel is actually there in spirit now, which is pretty wild. And he pays homage to him. He bows down to him because he knows it's Samuel. And it's really interesting. He doesn't see him there, but I can only imagine if he saw Samuel, I'd bet that Samuel probably even had the rip on his robe to kind of show, hey, remember, like this happened. And he references it later. I'm not sure we could actually see him because he's asking what does he look like, but I wouldn't be surprised. Verse 15 then says, then Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? Saul answered, I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me what I shall do. And Samuel said, why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? So at first, you see, he says, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? So you have to understand that Christ had not died on the cross yet, and there was the place of Sheol. Everybody went to the place of Sheol. Whether you were a believer or not, that was just the realm of the dead, because hell has not been created yet as we know it. It was the place of the dead. And back then, it wasn't, absent from the body, present with the Lord, not necessarily how we think of it today, because the Lord had not completed. That's why Jesus says, it is finished, and then he goes down, there's that whole thing going on there, but he was probably what we would consider Abraham's bosom. There's Abraham's bosom, right, that where we believe that the saints would have went. But he's down in this place of the dead, is what he's talking about. Why are you bringing me up from Sheol? And Saul continues on saying, I'm in great distress, the Philistines are warring against me. And, Saul probably felt like it was back in the old days. Hey, Samuel, give me some information. Remember every time I was in trouble and I was worried, I'd come to you? Give me some advice. And what's really interesting to me, by the way, is if you can just tell Saul's not in his right mind. Because every time Saul went to Samuel in the past, it was never good news. Would you ever go to the guy that gave you bad news all the time? Hey, it's going to be a really bad day for you today. Hey, I wouldn't do that if I were you. It's going to end poorly. And every time it did, and you're like, hey, I got to talk to this guy. Like, what, Saul? You are out of your mind. Samuel has never really given you a good word when you go against God. And guess what? You have now called a necromancer. You're definitely going against God. Samuel's pretty bummed. Like, why am I here? I don't want to be here. Now, what are you doing, Saul? So you can see Saul is out of his mind. And for some reason, he thinks Samuel is going to change, right? And by the way, if Samuel in this section would have said, hey, Saul, you're going to do great and you're going to do good things, then I would have believed it was a demon, right? I would have, because that's not the truth. And that would have been a lie. That's what demons do. They deceive and they lie and they trick. And demons could impersonate Samuel. But a demon is not going to give godly words and wisdom and things that will be fulfilled, because the true prophet is, it comes to be. And what Samuel says comes to be. And Samuel had already said what he's about to say. But you can see Saul's distressed about the war, and he turns to him, and Samuel says, why do you ask me? The Lord turned from you and he's become your enemy. You know this. If the Lord's quiet, then you're in trouble. The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, Samuel says, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. He's like, hey, don't you remember this whole thing? I said, you're going to lose the kingdom and you ripped my robe apart. Don't you remember that whole thing? I already told you how it's going to end. And by the way, we know again, Saul last chapter or 2 chapters ago said that he was even going to end this way. So he says, give it to your neighbor David. So now he mentions David. It's going to David. Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek, therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines. So right here he goes, we now know, which we already knew anyway, but we now know why Saul has been stripped of this, because he didn't fall down. There's a lot of things, right? There's a lot of things he did wrong, but the one that he really gets pinned, the sin he really gets pinned for, is he's supposed to wipe out the Amalekites. And remember, he left King Agag there and some of the nice things for himself. He kept some things for himself, so he was disobedient. He did not take directives very well. He got a directive from God through Samuel and did not take it seriously, right? So that's the one pinned upon, but he did all kinds of stuff. He offered a sacrifice when he shouldn't have. And Saul, as you can see, he's been doing a lot of things, but it is pinned here that he did not take care of Amalek. And later on in the end of the book, the Amalekites will come into play. We'll see more of that there. But another thing he says here, moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you in the hands of the Philistines. So again, we have to remember that our sins affect other people. Now, not always, right? Not all, your thought sins don't always affect other people. They can. But we know, like I talk about this a lot. If a woman drinks alcohol or does drugs when she's pregnant, that child didn't choose to do any of that stuff, but they will be negatively affected by that sin. Like, that's just the fact. That's just one example. We know all kinds of stuff, right? That, kids are being, stupid, throwing rocks out in the highway and now it actually hits a driver and kills somebody. Those things happen. Sins have retributions for people outside of you. So that's one other thing why you shouldn't sin. Not only is it an offense against God, but it can also affect the people around you. And now we're seeing Samuel saying, hey, by the way, because of what you did, Israel is going to die. Israel's going to be captured and they're going to lose the war because you sinned, Saul. And maybe if you would have been godly, Saul, they'd still be alive and everything would be fine. But because of that, your whole army is going down, is basically what he's saying. Then even worse, says, tomorrow, this must have been the worst message of all, you and your sons shall be with me, right? Now, by the way, this is reminiscent of, remember the beginning of 1 Samuel? Eli and Samuel both had 2 sons. And Samuel did a little bit better. There's Eli and Samuel's sons both went rogue, which one teaches us it doesn't matter sometimes if you do right or wrong. People are just going to go their own way. But Eli's problem, compared to Samuel, just like Saul and David are different, Eli refused to rebuke his sons, and because of that, his 2 sons were killed, along with Eli. And he fell off the back, broke his neck. Remember, after they let the ark be stolen by, guess who? The Philistines, by the way. But it's very, very much reminiscent of that. And just to touch on that again, if you remember, Samuel also had 2 sons that were sinful. The difference was Eli did not punish his sons. Samuel, you see his sons out with the congregation, means they're fired from their jobs. So that was the difference. Just like, you can say, well, why is Saul bad and David's good when David sinned? It was their reaction to sin, right? One repented, one tried to justify it. Saul's always justifying it. But that's what it reminds me of. But what it's saying here, your sons shall be with me. So Saul's basically saying, you guys are going to die. You and your sons will die tomorrow, which is really sad. I think the saddest thing of all this is that Jonathan is caught up in all this. And Jonathan was David's best friend, and he never wanted David to be hurt. He wanted David to be king. Remember, because Jonathan should have been the king next. But Jonathan was obedient, that he was like, nope, David, you're going to be the king. We're going to make this covenant, so when you're king, we're going to be friends. You're not going to kill me. I'm not going to kill you. It's going to be great. So he's going to end up dying, which we will see come to pass later. But people get caught up by this when it says, your sons shall be with me. Some people will say, oh, well, that's good for Saul. Even though all of his sin, he still gets to be with Samuel in heaven, right? Well, no. No, first of all, that's why I mentioned the whole Sheol situation. Because there's 2 holding cells, basically, in Sheol. You got Abraham's bosom on the other side where the rich man and Lazarus, that's where I'm getting a lot of this from, by the way. And so just to be down there with them, right? Just like Abraham and the rich man and Lazarus were both in Sheol, right? Did not have the same outcome, right? Lazarus had much better outcome than the rich man in that parable, right? He had a lot of a different outcome. So the same thing here. Just because they're coming down does not mean that Saul gets forgiven for all the things he did. It just means that he will be in the grave in the place of the dead with him. And I don't ever see, now you can argue, I don't know for sure if Saul's going to go to hell, but I imagine he is. The only reason I say that, and God's the judge, But because you never see repentance, even up to the end, as this will end in a couple chapters here, you never see that repentance like David did. David sinned and he repented. You don't see that from Saul. So I'm going to go ahead and make the argument, we'll find out in eternity, but that Saul was going down with Samuel, but not in the same holding place. I think Samuel was in Abraham's bosom, and Saul was over there hanging out with the rich man. Right? That's basically, and by the way, not really hanging out, and I don't want to give the idea that you hang out with people in hell because I think it's an isolation. It's not a party in hell. It's way worse than that. It's the absence of God, all kinds of stuff. But yeah, so that's what I think he means. I don't think he means, hey, you're going to come to heaven with me tomorrow and things will be good. I think it's pretty bad, right? Pretty bad. Then it continues on, the last couple verses, says, Then Saul fell at once full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel, and there was no strength in him, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. So basically, so you see he falls down, he hears those words. Probably not so much, again, that he's going to lose the war, that's bad, but that him and his sons are going to be with him tomorrow. He knows exactly what that means. Saul knows exactly what it means, that he's going to die and it's going to happen. And you can see here, he had no strength in him because he hadn't eaten. So he was fasting, right? There's two reasons he could have been fasting. One, he's so stressed out because how many of you have been so stressed out you can't eat, right? You can't eat, you can't sleep, you're so stressed out, right? Saul probably was stressed out. But he also might, again, remember, sometimes he's a spiritual guy every once in a while. Sometimes he probably was thinking, well, you know, I'm stressed out, but maybe if I don't eat, Samuel will come up and give me a good word. Because he knew that fasting, fasting and prayer will get you closer to God, and maybe God will give me an answer if I just start fasting. So I imagine it was probably a mix. That Saul's a little nervous. He's not really hungry anyway. And while he's not hungry, he said, maybe I'll just not fast. Maybe I'll just do that. Maybe God will give me the answer I want if I just don't fast. Which, by the way, when you fast, it doesn't ever mean you're going to get a changed or positive answer out of that, right? So Saul's all kinds of messed up, like I keep saying. So it says here that the medium of Endor, the witch of Endor, and the woman came to Saul, and when she saw that he was terrified, she said to him, Behold, your servant has obeyed you. I have taken my life in my hand and have listened to what you have said to me. Now, therefore, you also obey your servant. Let me set a morsel of bread before you and eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way. So, man, it's a bad day when the cultist is sitting down like, hey, you don't look so good. Here, eat some food. It's like, man, when that's your console, like you're hanging out, like the medium's your best friend now. Like, this is really bad news for you, Saul. Things are really taking a turn. And even she feels bad for the guy. Like, oh, man, that spirit, Saul, that God just said he's going to die. Poor guy should at least have some bread. It's almost like his final meal. Like, what do you want to eat, Saul? What do you want to eat? I got some bread. I got a fattened calf. Like, what do you want for your last meal? Because she heard the same thing that he heard, right? And it says he refused and said, I will not eat. But his servants together with him, and they urged him, he listened to their words. So he arose from the earth and sat on the bed. And basically, he gets up and sits on the bed. And the woman had a fattened calf in the house. She quickly killed it. She took flour and kneaded it and baked unleavened bread of it, which remember, unleavened bread is quicker because you don't need to wait for it to rise, right? So it's a quick meal. She makes that with the unleavened bread. And she put it before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they rose and went away that night. So that's kind of how the story ends. And again, it's kind of reminiscent of, you'll see in 2 Samuel, something similar happens to David where he's not hungry and he gets talked. Remember, patterns are in the Bible. Even David doesn't want to eat after the death of his baby with Bathsheba, and then they talk him into eating. So you can see that pattern here. But then it says they rose and went away that night, and you can only imagine how somber that walk would have been. It was probably a pretty quiet walk for Saul and his two servants, especially when they knew it was going to happen. I can only imagine what that would weigh on their hearts of knowing what's going to happen. And then that's kind of how that ends here before the next chapter we get back into the whole David and Philistine dilemma. So does anybody have any thoughts or questions based on that? Yeah, Beard.
So if we, looking at the prophetic capacity of demons, if we look in Acts, there's a scene where a demon-possessed servant is prophesying, and that's how they make money for their master.
Yes.
And they follow around, I think, Paul for several days, and Paul gets fed up and casts him out.
Cast him out, yeah.
But it's like, we're assuming that there's some accuracy for them, that they have some foresight in the fourth dimension,
right,
being able to see the future.
Right.
So if we roll that back to now, theoretically it could be possible that this is a demon telling the future, because these are just events that are about to happen the next day.
That is true.
Conceivably, it is possible that it is demon.
That is a good point, and there are people, like I said, there are people in really good pastors out there that'll say this is a demon because you can't bring people up from the dead, right? And once dead, always, it's appointed man wants to die, But I always say this isn't common, so don't expect that your loved one to get brought back from the dead, right? I don't think that's what this is about, because you have Lazarus die twice. Moses is going to die twice, I think, when you get to the tribulation. So you have these exceptions to the rule. I think there's an exception to the rule. However, Beard's making a pretty good argument because, like he's saying, if they somehow, and we don't know how the spirit world works when you get to, like he's saying, the fourth dimension time. They don't know for certain all the future because then they never would have killed Jesus, right? But you do see there's some weird things that go on. Where they get their information, we don't know. Sometimes maybe God allows it because God allowed Satan to do all the things. Perhaps God allows them to see partway into the future. And there are times that they can do these kind of things. And it is a chance. What he's saying is, because it's saying godly stuff doesn't mean it wasn't a demon, because he is correct. Paul gets annoyed. Remember, he's like, shut up. And really, she's like, Jesus, Jesus is the Savior. Like, she's saying good things, but it was in a bad spirit, a bad attitude, whether it was mocking or what it might have been. So she was saying all the right things, but he knew it was demon possession right there, and it was evil. So there is a chance that, that this is a demon, popped out and said, hey, I already know the answer. I'm just going to tell him what he knows. But I think, that's very possible. I think that it would have been maybe more deceptive. But it is very, very possible. And we don't know 100% for sure. All we know is that everything came true. Yeah.
I was thinking it was a demon too, because that's how it usually goes when you go to see those people, and why we shouldn't do it. But the fact that she was freaked out.
Yeah, she's surprised.
And it was like something of light, and it seems like it's something she's not used to seeing, that maybe it wasn't a demon. That's
my biggest piece of evidence for that, because she's a necromancer, or medium, and she's freaked out. Now, there's two reasons people say. So some people that are on Beard's side would counter you and I, Missy, and they'll say, well, yeah, she was freaked out because she was a fake. She was a phony, and she was making all money off people and lying to them, and now she's freaked out because there's really a spirit. But I think it's more like what you're saying. I think she was working with familiar spirits. As a medium, you probably have your set go-tos. You probably have the people you communicate with in a handful. I'd imagine that's how it works. I don't know. I know somebody who has really touched evil, not good stuff. That stuff's real. But I'd imagine if you're dealing, it's almost like, imagine, you're at work and you have your friend, your couple coworkers that you always work with, and then one day this other person walks in and you're like, whoa, who are you? Like, I've never talked with you. I've never seen you in here before, right? Very similar thing. And she knows right away that it's Saul. So Samuel somehow she was tipped off a lot of information that maybe Saul couldn't hear, we don't know. But the fact that she's freaked out and surprised, I think, is a good argument. And I don't think she's a fake, only because his servants knew of the Witch of Endor. She knew of the medium of Endor, which I think she probably had some popularity. But we don't know for certain, and it'll probably be ambiguous until we get to eternity. But the fact that she was surprised leads me to believe. And it was, and the fact, the demons knew also, you can make the argument, well, they don't die either, and they knew that the robe was ripped and stuff, but Samuel's actually using the actual language there. Do you have something to say?
Mine has a side note that says maybe it was God intervening and raising Samuel himself.
Yes, and I think so, because remember, God's not in a box. He can do whatever he wants. He has a set of parameter rules, right? I kind of explain this to people who play video games. The video game has these rules, right? And if your car goes off the road, that's all it can do, and you can only stay in things. However, if you have the code, the God codes or whatever, you can break the rules, right? God can do that. And he only does that for a reason and for necessities, right? And here it seems that God, for one time and one time only, there's no other example that I know of in the Bible, he comes out and allows someone to be actually brought up for the divine reason to pronounce judgment on him, which Samuel's been doing over and over. And it's like one more final judgment. So I do think it was God probably intervening. Like I said, we don't know for sure, but all we know is that there was a real spirit that came out and said a true prophecy that ended up, we'll see later, we didn't read about it, but I'm sure most of you know, everything that was just said comes true. And then they all die, so. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, Missy.
And when the rich man in Luke 16 said, can you send Lazarus to come back from the dead to talk to my family? Abraham didn't say it can't happen. He just said they won't believe him anyway.
They won't listen anyway, exactly. Right, and again, anything's possible. And that's what they always say. They say, well, you're not going to listen to them, you're not going to listen to me. It's not, it doesn't say it's not possible, it's just there's no point in it, right? That's a really great point. And like I said, there's a few exceptions. Like, I actually think it's sad for Lazarus that he had to die twice. Like, I would only want to die once, but he had to die twice, right? And actually, I always think, if I'm correct, some people will disagree with me, but if Moses is one of the two witnesses, man, he had such a crazy ride. He died, and people were fighting over his body, and then he came back to the Transfiguration, then he goes and gets killed, then he gets raised up from the dead. Sometime we'll do a whole Moses character study, just so I can talk about that crazy stuff. That's wild. Any other questions or comments based on this are great. I don't think of anybody online to comment yet. All right. Well, with that said, thank you again. Go ahead. We'll be back next week. 1 Samuel 29. That's where the David and Achish saga is going to pick back up. We'll see what happens there. But until next time, keep your lamps trimmed and burning, and have a great week.